in progressing the pathway to truth-telling and treaty, as well as the long outstanding legislative reforms surrounding the cultural heritage protection and land returns. Recognising that there may be complex sensitivities surrounding cultural heritage reforms and land returns, both within the Tasmanian Aboriginal community and the broader communities, more detail on the government's process to consult and develop new Tasmanian Aboriginal cultural heritage legislation, particularly since the 2021 Pathway to Truth-Telling and Treaty Reports, Recommendation 19. It states this, but that recommendation states it is titled Reform of the Aboriginal Heritage Act 1975, TAS, as a matter of urgency. And it specifically states this under that recommendation. We recommend that reform of this Act should not wait for a truth-telling or treaty process. So there was a real prompt there to get moving with it. Also, I do wonder where the government is progressing with other recommendations from the 2021 Pathway Report. For example, increasing the joint management of Crown land, parks and reserves as proposed by Recommendation 15, as well as the creation of Kununyi Mount Wellington as an Aboriginal protected area as per Recommendation 13. Or perhaps the implementation of Recommendation 13 gets a little complicated now given the Premier's public support for a cable car on Kununyi. Maybe not, but that should be clarified. Or another example, the Tasmanian Aboriginal Art and Cultural Centre as detailed in Recommendation 20. Does it need to wait for a truth-telling process, and if so, why? Or perhaps also there's sensitivity there given that Macquarie Point was a proposed site for such a centre and perhaps the Premier's pursuit of a stadium on that site now has displaced the realisation of that recommendation from the report. I do wonder also about the recommendation to reconstitute the Aboriginal and dual naming reference group and the recommendation to establish a Tasmanian Indigenous Education Consultative Body. What is their respective status? What's the government doing about implementing or addressing these and other recommendations which possibly could be progressed partially or wholly independent of the advisory group's current work on identifying the truth-telling and treaty process, and which ones are reliant, and it would be good to understand which ones are in fact reliant on that work first. Madam Acting President, I had mentioned earlier the Tasmanian Women's Honour Roll inductee Jessie Rook, honoured on International Women's Day this year. That day has been celebrated since it was first held on the 8th of March 1911, yet over a century later we still have a long way to go before we achieve gender equality. I note the release of the Tasmanian 2022 to 27 Women's Strategy in December last year, and again it's disappointing that that didn't warrant a mention in the Premier's address as a good news story. Valuable and considerable work has gone into the development of that strategy, and now here is not the place to provide a thorough analysis of it, but there are a couple of points that I want to make as they illustrate key themes that I've explored during this contribution that relate to that report. The 2022 to 27 Women's Strategy makes a first good step towards acknowledging the complexities surrounding and the need for an understanding of the impacts of intersectionality upon systemic disadvantage and barriers to full participation and equality. These intersectionalities may involve the multiple impacts not only of gender but of sexuality, religion, ethnicity, age and disability. The intersectionality picture is far from complete here in the state, and we've got work to do, which the strategy acknowledges. There needs to be a concerted effort to collate data, to develop an appropriate framework by which to interrogate that data and then to use it to help us drive strategies consistently across government to dismantle any systemic barriers that are experienced. Gender equality has long been recognised as both a human rights issue and an economic issue. And I do note in her press club speech on International Women's Day this year, Sam Mostyn, the chair of the National Women's Economic Equality Task Force, highlighted that while the national full-time gender pay gap may now be at a record low, women still earn less on average on every indicator. And she further pointed to the gender segregation and segmentation in how we work, with workforce segmentation then influencing the distribution of take-home salary, superannuation and other economic security considerations. A key point that Sam Mostyn emphasised while discussing economic gender segmentation is the potential untapped contribution due to gender inequality. She stated this, and I'll quote, "Smart policy that will unlock multiple contributions of women to Australian society, including as people, partners, parents, employees, entrepreneurs, employers and change makers, and provide them with the visibility, confidence, skills and opportunity they need to maximise their economic contribution." Madam Acting President, this goes to resilience and bridging that yawning gap between potentially the two Tasmanias, which may also have a gender aspect to it. Addressing the systemic areas of disadvantage and bias that continue to hold women and girls and gender fluid Tasmanians from participating fully, not just in economic spheres, but in all areas of their lives, invests in both individual resilience as well as broader resilience for our society and our economy. It invests in the well-being of our people, our communities and our businesses. There are many ways we can all be gender champions. Nationally, the federal government has committed to releasing an annual Status of Women report card every International Women's Day. And I would urge the Tasmanian Government to follow suit in some similar manner, to provide current data by which Tasmanians can evaluate in a meaningful manner how we're going on meeting our gender equality goal, and also how we're countering systemic barriers impeding future participation and realisation of potential for Tasmanian women, girls and members of our community who identify as gender fluid. It would be really quite a companion piece, probably already there in the work that goes towards putting together the gender snapshot around the budget, so quite complementary. I think also consideration could be given to providing a similar Status of Men report card every International Men's Day, which we all know is the 19th of November. I think that would also be a valuable way to highlight current data to assist in evaluating how well Tasmanian men are being supported, especially in areas that we know are of particular vulnerability or challenge to Tasmanian men. So that's something we can consider across the gender spectrum. Madam Acting President, it will come as no surprise to many members here that I regard a key outstanding piece of any legislative agenda for this parliamentary year to be the introduction of a long overdue Tasmanian Human Rights Act. And I will not miss any opportunity to speak about that in this place. In fact, on the 22nd of November last year in this chamber, we voted in support of a motion calling for the government to, and I quote, "consider marking the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by initiating consultation on a Human Rights Act for Tasmania." And of course 2023, this year, is that 75th anniversary, Madam Acting President.
Through you, Madam Acting President, it is really worth noting that it was an Australian that was in the chair when that declaration was made. Yep. 1948.
Indeed. The Premier's address this year would have been a really wonderful and appropriate time and place for the government to respond to that call that our chamber made. We do know that the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute is currently reviewing its 2007 seminal report, which strongly recommended Tasmania introduce a Human Rights Act. They're looking to update and contemporise that recommendation within a current context, almost 2 decades following their initial research, consultation and findings. The formal recognition of human rights for all Tasmanians would provide a tangible and significant mechanism by which we can begin bridging the divide and bring back together the two Tasmanias we risk seeing cemented in their fractured state. And significantly, it would provide a framework by which policy decisions can be evaluated and assessed in a coherent and inclusive manner prior to and during their implementation. A Human Rights Act provides a clear opportunity by which to invest in the robustness and resilience of our community's human and civil rights, a fundamental area to seek to future shock-proof us as a state and our community, you would think. Hopefully, the updated TLRI report will be released in the near future, and the government is on notice that there is an expectation they'll engage with that report thoroughly and genuinely, and most importantly, act to progress recommendations towards the Tasmanian Human Rights Act in a manner that truly respects and delivers on the intent of that report. Madam Acting President, another puzzling area of silence in the Premier's address this year relates to climate change and the status of Tasmania's preparation to tackle this widely recognised greatest public policy challenge of our time. And because I was contemplating the theme of resilience when I was thinking about the Premier's address this year and my response to it, this was a natural area that came up in terms of climate change resilience. Indeed, at the time when I was first preparing this response, noting that was a few months ago now, at that time the latest salutary Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, was released. The latest report, it unequivocally states the situation is worse than previously evaluated and warns there is a rapidly closing time window to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. A further summary point delivered by this latest IPCC report states this, and I quote, "Climate change has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people that are unequally distributed across systems, regions and sectors. Economic damages from climate change have been detected in climate-exposed sectors such as agriculture, forestry, fishery, energy and tourism. Individual livelihoods have been affected through, for example, destruction of homes and infrastructure and loss of property and income, human health and food security, with adverse effects on gender and social equity." End of quote. So clearly, Madam Acting President, it's no longer a radical but rather a sensible and responsible approach to acknowledge that climate change poses huge and long-lasting, if not irrevocable, challenges to our human rights, to equal inclusivity and accessibility, to our food security and also to our economy. As detailed by that IPCC report, it also poses huge and long-lasting challenges to a range of our economic sectors, to our capacity to maintain essential infrastructure, to our ecological security and biodiversity, to the health of our oceans, no small thing for an island state, and to our sense of well-being individually and collectively. The climate change challenge is a human rights challenge. To put it simply, climate change impacts everything we take for granted and virtually everything we rely upon as we go about our daily lives. And this latest clarion call made by the IPCC reiterates the situation will not improve on its own. It therefore needs to be integrated consistently, comprehensively throughout the myriad of policy decisions made by all tiers of government. I acknowledge, Madam Acting President, the Minister responsible released the next Climate Change Action Plan draft at the beginning of March this year, and the public consultation has occurred on that. And I believe just today that the final version of that Climate Change Action Plan has in fact been released. I've yet to have an opportunity to take a look at that plan released today. However, I know that people want and expect not just a climate action plan that hangs off the sides of other government decisions and policies and action plans, but one that's central to and drives the focus of a whole-of-government approach. I hope to see that when I look at the plan released today. It would be a shame if Tasmanians felt that instead there was a default business-as-usual approach in play. It would have been reassuring, I think, to hear in the annual agenda-setting Premier's address the Premier seizing the opportunity to present a really clearly articulated vision of how the government intends to apply climate change mitigation and adaptation across all aspects of the governance of our state. Maybe next year. Madam Acting President, I noted in the Premier's address comments relating to population growth for our state and the desire that people who migrate here will have a home, access to great education, world-class healthcare, skills and training and career pathways. And those are laudable aspirations. There were accompanying comments about a focus on regional demography work, which would need to be done to plan for the needs of the Tasmanian population as it grows over the longer term. And I was particularly interested, my ears pricked up in the Premier's address, at the proposal to establish a role of a state demographer. Although I haven't seen that brought to reality in the state budget presented last week, perhaps I missed it. It may be there and we may have more detail of it from estimates. I'm certainly supportive of strategic evidence-based approaches, and I can see how the role of a state demographer could make a valuable contribution in terms of expert advice and leadership to feed through into government decision-making. A sense of slightly independent advice as well that could be relied on regardless of the government of the day. I would also see a real opportunity for synergy there with that new state demographer role to also establish a complementary role that would operate alongside in the area of community wellbeing, equity and inclusion. Somebody similarly who could provide that expert advice and leadership and bring that evidence-based strategic thinking to the challenges that we face when we are forward-looking for our state on those matters. I think that sort of tandem approach, such that would be a significant investment in forward-looking resilience building for our state. Excuse me. So, in summary, Madam Acting President, when I first considered this year's State of the State address delivered by Premier Rockliff, I found myself, funnily enough, at that time, wondering whether there's another imminent state election around the corner. And surprisingly, here I am a few months down the track now delivering my response, and I'm even more curious that that was my potentially first impression on hearing the address back at the end of February. Some may consider that a little cynical, but for the opportunity presented by the annual Premier's address, which is an opportunity to deliver a coherent vision for Tasmania's future, measured against an equally coherent report card measuring progress and an energetic legislative agenda by which to tackle the work still to do, to not seize that opportunity does raise fair questions over where the government is at and what its priorities are. And quite frankly, that was my assessment of this year's Premier's address, that it didn't seize that opportunity in a fulsome way that we would expect. Instead, what we heard in the Premier's address this year, I think, was more about the state of the government rather than the state of Tasmania. And of course, it's not unusual for governments of any stripe to slip into conflating their perceived particular political interests with the state's interests. However, history tells us when the rhetoric is amped up in this area, when is this degree of an emphasis on flag waving, highlighting, look at what we've done compared to our political opponents almost a decade ago, instead of an emphasis on here is what still needs to be done in our state, here is our plan to achieve it, and here's how we're going to take you forward. It's not surprising that people may detect a government sliding potentially into an electioneering mode, or perhaps sliding into some complacency. So, Madam Acting President, I'll conclude my remarks there. They've been a little bit edited on the fly as I delivered them today, but I still feel that they represent what my reflections were when the Premier delivered his Premier's address earlier in the year. And certainly I believe that sense of resilience that we need in this state as we emerge from a pandemic, but also as we continue to tackle our long-standing and enduring and worsening in some ways divisions and slipping inequity, that we really need to be all focused on resilience building, and I hope to see a better expression of that as we go forward, perhaps even in next year's Premier's address. So I note the address.
The question is that the Premier's address be noted.